What the hell is wrong with Marvel Comics anyway? That's a good question. This article goes back a little bit when retailers were actually willing to talk about what the issues were. I might not agree with everything they say. They might not agree with everything I say, but at least they would discuss the issues without trying to pretend that they don't exist. Let's get into this article. Before we do, if you want to support my work, subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications. You can also pick up collegeofthedead.com, my zombie apocalypse series, where college costs you an arm and a leg. And you can sign up at epicmermaids.com for the upcoming ongoing series, The Mermaids. It's a full-color series. It's like a Game of Thrones with mermaids. Very, very cool series. You will love it. Let's get back to the article. All right, so this is coming from Brian Hibbs in The Beat. And it's part of his ongoing series, Tilting at Windmills. A lot of interesting articles in there. So right now, Marvel Comics is in a little spot of trouble. On February 2017, Marvel's best-selling ongoing superhero title barely passed 60,000 copies on the Diamond sales chart. They ran 3 event-style crossovers, which sold fewer copies than that, and Clone Conspiracy and Monsters Unleashed, neither of which cracked 50,000 copies. In fact, in what's probably has to be the first for Marvel, other than Amazing Spider-Man, they don't have any ongoing superhero titles selling over 50,000 copies in February. Amazing Spider-Man has always sold good numbers for Marvel, always, consistently. DC, meanwhile, places 15 superhero titles selling over 50,000 that month, so you have a reasonable comparative. Well, it's not reasonable for these books to sell less than 100,000 copies, really regardless of the price. Because really, it used to be not too long ago, if copies were selling less than 100,000 per copies per book, they would be canceled. It wouldn't even be worth producing this series. And now, yes, they have TV, film, licensing, video games, all sorts of cool things that bring in all sorts of money. So now they can use the comics more for a social agenda than they need to use it as a profit center. But those sales are terrible for both Marvel and DC. Back to the article. This has led to Marvel taking several pretty unprecedented for them steps, the chief of which might be holding a retailer summit in New York, as well as building a secret Facebook group to discuss Marvel marketing with retailers. While it might be possible to argue the full value of these efforts, the Facebook group in particular only allows positive points on Marvel, so it's less of a valuable conversation between peers. Well, they're not obviously not peers with Marvel. They're retail stores, not publishers. They're industry participants, but they're not peers. They perform a different part of the process. Marvel does not openly participate in any other retailer-focused messaging boards and Facebook groups. It does represent some of the move towards more open retailer communication that has been mostly absent in the decades since Marvel's bankruptcy. Now, you will see what comes of them having open communication with retailers. Retailers try to tell them. They try to say, hey, look, we've got a serious problem here. So you understand Brian, he's from the San Francisco area, the author of this article, and he's very, very SJW kind of guy. And, that's fine. But even he is at least discussing the realities of some of the things going on. But the last time Marvel kind of opened themselves up to have open communication and say, like, well, this is what people are telling us when we're trying to sell these books, you'll see the response they get. But for all these attempts, it appears from the outside that Marvel is receiving many of the, quote, wrong messages about why the market is saying. Okay. But for all of these attempts, it appears from the outside that Marvel is receiving many of the, quote, wrong messages about what the market is saying. This is probably best represented by this widely spread interview with David Gabriel, SVP, Senior Vice President, of Sales and Marketing at Marvel. David was indelicate in some quotes, but I do think that most internet commentators willfully misread what David was attempting to say here. So they're trying to deny reality, but let's get the quote. Quote, I don't know if that's a question for me. I think that's a better question for retailers who are seeing all publishers. What we heard, the truth is painful, what we heard was that people didn't want any more diversity. They didn't want female characters out there. That's what we heard, whether we believe that or not. I don't know what's really true, but that's what we saw in sales. We saw the sales of any character that was diverse, any character that was new, or female characters, anything that was not a core Marvel character, people were turning their nose up against. That was difficult for us because we had a lot of fresh, new, exciting ideas that we were trying to get out, and nothing really worked. So what he's saying is, look, this is what retailers are saying. And the thing of it is it doesn't mean you can't introduce characters from all kinds of backgrounds and all looks and shapes and sizes. It means you really can't pretend that it's appropriate to just make a superhero have unlimited powers. There are certain rules and aesthetics to superhero storytelling that the customer base expects, and they actually make sense, and they were developed over decades. So to just throw in a character and say, like, well, why can't, a bunny rabbit, well, the bunny rabbit obviously could be a soldier or something like that, but why can't, a 4-year-old girl come in and beat up the Hulk? Or why can't you just throw in, change the genders of all the characters? You can't just change stuff all around and expect existing customers to be happy with that. If you want to introduce something, obviously you have to introduce it in the context of what people already are interested in and expect, such as like a new side dish with a meal. You can have something like, wow, there's this unusual rice side dish along with my steak. I think I'll eat that. I'll try it. Or maybe I won't try it. But it's introduced in context. It's a flavor of. And you have to build things over time. The Marvel Universe was built over, 50, 60, 70 years? You can't just throw other new, quote, exciting ideas into existing what's supposed to be continuity and expect people are just going to rave about it and say, wow, this is fantastic. Back to the article. To me, nowhere in there says that David or Marvel thinks diversity is a problem. Quite the opposite. He sounds frustrated there, which is good because the diversity canard is a distraction at best. Well, it's not a distraction at best because it's not the core of what was wrong at Marvel. There was a lot wrong at Marvel before they started using it for social propaganda. But it's a big part of it. It's one of the things that having forced diversity, having expectations be disrupted and subverted when people are just trying to buy a copy of whatever the book is, X-Men, Spider-Man, Iceman, doesn't matter what the heck the title is. You're not supposed to not deliver what people promise. So if you're promised a steak, you're not supposed to get a soy chicken burger. You have to deliver what you promise. Otherwise, people will, quote, turn their nose up at it, end quote. I'm very much of the opinion that a significant number of the blame points that the internet magnifies, for example, I need a digital code, or there are too many SJW versions of these characters. Yeah, there should never be an SJW, quote, version of a character. If you want a character that's like this author, Brian, it's an SJW, fine. You make him an SJW, bring him in or bring her in or whatever, and let them do what they want to do and say what they want to say, but you have to create and develop that character. And if it takes 30 or 40 years to make it successful, that's on the author to make something compelling. Are not actually the true culprits of Marvel's recent change in fortunes. Instead, they're what a readership without the tools to really express what their deeper feelings are latches onto to try to express their concerns. Well, it's the most obvious, ridiculous thing. This is a great quote pulled out. The Marvel zombie tribe has been hunted to extinction by Marvel's own sales practices. Well, that's true. The sales practices are poor, meaning producing too many variants, too many books, changing around the continuity too much, not having continuity, not respecting the canon. But Marvel Zombies was an expression to refer to not the Robert Kirkman series, but people who just bought anything that Marvel published, because they had that for years. There were people that, yes, would just buy anything that Marvel published. But part of doing that is, first, the publishing plan to make it reasonable that people could afford to, as consumers, buy everything that you're putting out. it's cultivating that group of customers, and that was done very deliberately. Marvel could have always produced 100 or 200 titles a month if they wanted to. They didn't, because they understood that people would be too splintered in focusing on these titles, those titles, and would lose interest in buying the overall house brand. Which that Marvel even used to have a house art style where essentially you could look at a Marvel comic and say, yeah, that definitely belongs to that publishing line. That was given up after Jim Shooter left in the 1980s. The author tries to draw similarities to Obamacare to say that people want to repeal it, and they don't really mean that, because there are aspects of it that everyone likes. Like, well, that's political. Back to the article. I think that a goodly portion of the complaints is really looking at the trees and not particularly seeing the forest, because I think Marvel's core problem in the last decade has been a lack of judiciousness more than anything else. I've been selling comics long enough to remember the Marvel Zombie, the guys who were buying the entire output and loving it, even at the height of Sandman, the Neil Gaiman series, Salad Days, for my main store, when we were a significant prototype of the Vertigo store. We had always had scores, back when they didn't destroy the Vertigo brand at DC, right? We had always had scores of zombies shopping here, and we loved them for it. But the tribe has been hunted to extinction by Marvel's own sales practices. First, the Marvel zombies started to fracture into families, becoming the Avengers zombies or the X-Men zombies, and then it descended further down into the character-driven purchasing as they expanded your line, not just by title count, but also by frequency of release, as well as overall cost to collect. It isn't merely that there's never fewer than 6 Avengers title books going on at a single time, but that Marvel prices each of them at $4 minimum and tries to publish as many titles as it possibly can at 16 to 18 times a year. The harder you make it to collect Marvel comics, the fewer people will do so, and that audience fracturing has finally come home to roost. Well, it's not finally coming home to roost. This is the numbers going down more and more and more as the decades have rolled on, as the aesthetic value of purchasing a Marvel title meant less and less and less, and it was the single individual character that you'd buy. People would buy, when they're buying the Marvel line, they would buy the best-selling books and they would buy the less-selling books, but you wouldn't have one book that sold 10 times the copies of another book. Typically, people would buy almost the entire line, and it was deliberate editorially. Conversation I had with Jim Shooter back in the Valiant days was he was very proud that none of the titles were selling any more than 20% more or less than the other titles. Obviously, except for a #1 issue, people would buy a lot of extra copies of that, because it was planned that people would find value in, and the release schedule was consistent with having people be able to buy all of the books so they would support the line. And also those books, the Valiant books, had a certain look. They had a storytelling style. They had a visual presentation and a design aesthetic that was consistent. On a personal stat, I always try to get across that my main store, most mainstream superhero style books, because of mismanagement of the brands by publishers, have dropped down to pre-orders plus 1 or 2 rack copies. Generally speaking, this yields sell-ins that are sub 20 copies for most titles, and a truly depressing number of books are sub 5. So meaning to say, like, he's only ordering copies now, this is even a little while ago, but he's only ordering copies now that are the pre-order copies that people say, hey, I want this coming out. It's coming out in a couple months. They pre-order it, plus 1 or 2 copies for the rack, meaning 1 or 2 copies to put on a shelf. Because otherwise, if he was to buy more, he feels like he wouldn't be able to sell them. And I'm sure he's right. Sell-through is thus what matters for retailers as a class, and it's virtually impossible to sell comics profitably if your initial orders are low. Even a book like Amazing Spider-Man, we are now down to a bare 11 pre-orders, and we're selling just 3 or 4 more additional copies on the rack of current issues. There's no room to go long here. I really have only 2 copy tolerance for unsold goods, because that's what a flagship book with the line becomes, an issue by issue break-even proposition at best. It's just math. Yeah, he's just saying they don't want to buy copies that they can't sell because the books are being sold non-returnable, and if they aren't sold on the stand, they become unsaleable garbage immediately, and you lose money as a retailer. But the point is that if Spider-Man took a sudden quality shift that might draw new eyes to it, it's difficult for retailers to then fully capitalize on any change because the overproduction of comics in general, and Marvel Comics in particular, has fractured and fragmented the audience significantly. So that's to say, like, even if they just decide, okay, let's make Spider-Man great over at Marvel, he has no way to really promote that to his customer base. Because the only way to promote that would be buying a lot of non-returnable copies that he would have to assume the whole risk of, which is it's not worth it for him. And here's where the sell-through becomes critical. In the ICV2, Internal Correspondence, Volume 2, it's a website, interview, David Gabriel talked about how Marvel views the recent $10 issue of Amazing Spider-Man as a win because it was triple dollar sold, except that was sell-in, meaning non-returnable pre-orders from retailers to the distributors. Sell-through, at least in my 2 stores worth of micro analysis, was significantly driven down because of the $10 cover price, and much worse, it caused multiple long-term Amazing Spider-Man subscribers to drop the book entirely from their pull lists. Over the course of the next year, that $10 issue was very likely to yield a 10% or more lower dollars for the entire year, and they thought it was a win. So he's saying at a $10 retail price, even though they convinced retailers to buy it because they felt they needed to, they didn't sell well, and people just decided, like, all right, I don't really need Spider-Man on my pull list, because if they're not going to buy that $10 Spider-Man issue, then they're not going to buy the next issue that's going to go back down to $4 or $5, whatever they're charging for it. Meanwhile, we're selling 160 copies of Saga every month on pre-orders of about 80 copies. The takeaway here, as I see it, is that there was no lack of customers for periodical comics, and there's no lack of passion and energy for the format, and that there's no indication that casual readers won't be interested in purchasing periodical comics. A big chunk of those Saga readers, like the Sandman wave that happened 2 decades before, are not normal traditional Wednesday warriors, meaning people that buy books on Wednesdays when the new comics come out. Yet they are still stoked to buy periodical comics. But that Marvel and DC largely have harmed their own sales and chased their own customers away. There's a problem when I sell 160 sagas and 16 copies of Amazing Spider-Man, but this is a problem of Marvel's making over the accumulation of time. Saga is also very consistent, and it's by the same creators, so it doesn't have a wild shift in quality, and there aren't going to all of a sudden be 18 Saga titles coming out all in the same month to freak people out and make customers fragment and not support it. So if ASM is going to, Amazing Spider-Man, is going to stay as 15 to 18 times a year at $3.99, with some issues being much more expensive, in a family of other Spider-Man titles that are also produced the same way, well, even if Marvel finds some sort of rejuvenating formula, perhaps by going back to basics, I don't see how I push the order form for an issue significantly to anything more than 25, maybe 30 copies without the risk on my end becoming out of control in relationship to both the reward as well as recent history. Even then, I'll have to have a hard argument with my store managers to win them over. Yeah. So, why should he support Spider-Man if he can't consistently know that it's going to be good, and that they're not going to release so many of them, or release them at a high cover price, and or change Spider-Man into a flying chicken, and then disinterest people in whatever it is he took a risk on? How is he supposed to know what the heck is going to happen? So why would he support selling Spider-Man? It's not predictable. In business, if things aren't predictable, they fall apart very quickly. So plan everything in advance, be strategic, and deal with predictable people in predictable situations. And you take a risk every now and then, but being predictable and being consistent is what minimizes risk. I want to be clear. This isn't me saying I can't sell Spider-Man. I don't think that at all. I think a properly launched, properly marketed, properly published Spider-Man in a comic in an ecosystem where it isn't surrounded by too many brand-killing spin-offs could absolutely do well. I fundamentally and completely think that there's a market for Spider-Man comics done right in multiples of what they're selling of Saga. Okay. Why? Well, beyond Saga, clearly and directly showing me that there's a huge market for the right periodical to the right market. We've had our best superhero success in something like a decade with Marvel's Black Panther. Okay. The first issue was our #1 best-selling title of 2016. We sold near double the copies we did of Saga, and I'm sure we can sell way more than that of the right Spidey comic in an ecosystem where Spidey comics are actually something special. This tells you why maybe they licensed Spider-Man over to IDW. And it also limited IDW from making any kind of crazy changes with Spider-Man. They certainly can't do spin-offs. People who say the new audience inherently don't want superheroes or don't want periodicals are fundamentally wrong. They just don't want them in the way they're being offered. With Black Panther, it was tons of new faces, diverse faces, genuinely excited about comics, and they were vibing on it. Oh yeah. Until Marvel saw it and had a hit on its hand and decided to push out Black Panther, World of Wakanda, and then Black Panther, The Crew. And this new audience began to leap off in droves because they don't grasp or want Marvel's publishing plan. Yeah, too much is just too much, right? Seriously, our sales drop off on Black Panther is significantly worse than similar titles launches, and you can see the deflection points accelerate as the additional titles were released. Less is more when it comes to entertainment and branding, something I said all the way back in my 9th column in 1993. He's been writing these a long time, which is mostly just copying, and something that Joe Kelly said back in 1976. We're just about to move to our website, so I'm pretty positive. I think that link is not broken. If you want to check out the link, I'll have it in the article. Adding a second Black Panther title doesn't double your sales. Instead, it causes X% of Panther readers to walk away instead. People do get overwhelmed when there's too much of something. They do. And you want relatability with the character, and you want people to be able to comprehend what's going on. And if you want to add a sister title, you can do that. You can have a second title. But you have to be very careful about how you release it. It can't just be multiple more of the same. It does get confusing, and the last thing you want a customer to be is confused. You want them to understand what it is they're getting, and you want them to see the value in it immediately. People do not see value when they see confusion. They see confusion, they run the other way. It's not at all appealing. It's not relatable. The same thing happened with Doctor Strange and Sorcerer Supreme launching. The same thing happened when Marvel published 2 different Squirrel Girl issue #1s in a single year, or when they expanded Guardians of the Galaxy into like 6 books or more in a month to the new audience. The ones who have been freshly minted this decade, they don't understand Marvel's publishing plans. They're not looking for a line of comics. They're looking for a comic. You know, you can sell consumers on a line of comics. Absolutely. It's been done many times successfully. But, #1, you can't overwhelm them. If you overwhelm them, it's as bad as confusing them. They're going to run the other way. #2, you have to remember you're selling them on a line. They have to immediately understand what they're being sold. You're presenting the benefit of having more than one title. You want people to say, hey, I want to have more. I want to have more. Not, okay, what is all of this more? You know, people should really be practically asking for it. So that's how too much of a good thing turns into not a good thing at all. That new young woman who's buying Squirrel Girl, for the most part, she's not looking for 5 more female heroines to go along with it. That's not to say that maybe she couldn't be convinced to buy more comics. She can, but they have to be different flavors. He's right about that. They have to be complementary, different stories that organically come up or are planned incredibly well by someone who's like an editor-in-chief. Like, you have to do that. It's got to be planned. It can't just be 5 copies or 10 copies of the same thing. They emphatically don't want a line like when we were kids. Well, again, yes, people do want lines, and they're willing to buy lines, but no one goes looking to buy a line. In the micro, the kid who is buying Totally Awesome Hulk is most likely going to jump the heck off if that book crosses over into Weapon X, especially when you add an extra and above $5 special there as part of the crossover. That kid didn't care if it's creatively valid, being driven by the writer's story. What he cares about is he just wants to read the Awesome Hulk, Totally Awesome Hulk. Up and down the line, Marvel is constantly pushing for customers to buy more and more, And that worked for a while, even a good long while, but I think those days are now gone, and so they've made it harder for people to draw people into the line without a truly radical rethink of how they publish comics, such as licensing them to IDW maybe. One website seems to be getting leaks that suggest that Marvel's new path is to look backwards and to do what he calls the meat and potatoes comics, and there's some small evidence that this could potentially work. Witness DC's Rebirth. Oh yeah. But I strongly believe that if Marvel continues on the path publishing too many titles, diluting their brands, and publishing far too many frequently at too high of a price, they've got an uphill battle on their hands. The old customer, the Marvel zombies, they're largely gone at this point, and they have been for many years. Yeah, it's sad. It's too bad because, they worked hard to develop a customer base that was really interested in everything that they did and knew that any Marvel comic you bought, literally any Marvel comic that you would buy, would look and feel like a Marvel comic. It may not exactly be your type of story, but if you believed in what Marvel was as a brand, and you were interested in it as a brand, every successful Marvel book and every weaker Marvel title had built into every book that brand value, that brand aesthetic. We've gone at least a whole generation of readers who don't even know what a Marvel zombie is. That's bad. And so doing things that seem designed to cater to an audience that left already with legacy heroes and legacy numbering seems fairly well designed not to hit with the market that exists in pursuit of a market that got chased away. Solving Marvel's problems is not my job, but I would say it's massive, and they have to start obviously from values of what they think a good comic book should be and what they think a Marvel comic should be, and any Marvel comic should be something that people can look at and say, yes, this is a Marvel comic and it's got a cool aesthetic and something that people want. And it means that they have to really put in place standards. They used to have an imprint called Epic Comics in the 80s, and they have other creator-owned imprints since. But Epic Comics, anything goes. You could do anything you want in Epic Comics. Usually not with legacy characters, but sometimes even with a legacy character like Elektra coming out of the Marvel's continuity. But anyway, you never knew what you were going to get with Epic Comics. Those were creator-owned, fascinating, and interesting books, and that's fine. But when you buy a Marvel comic, you should know what you're going to get. That's the point. I don't think Marvel can successfully publish multiple incarnations of a large percentage of their brands. It cuts the audience down to levels that are unsustainable for sell-through. I don't think I can sell 2 Hulk comics a month, just like we can't sell 2 Captain America titles or 2 Iron Man titles, going back to 2 Fantastic Four titles, unless you stop overextending the audience. And the Generations plan seems to imply they're going for a double down. Instead, the mass audience isn't going to come back because they don't understand or want a line. Well, this is not a line. What Marvel has been doing is not a line of comics. It is a mishmash of a bunch of hashed out junk. It's not done with any sort of strategic initiative with a coherent messaging and aesthetic value that consumers could get behind and become interested in and be sold on. It's just as he's explaining, it's impossible for him to sell people on this stuff because there's nothing to sell people on. It's incoherent. There's the conversation going around that somehow diversity is to blame for all this. Iron Man's a black woman, Hulk is a Korean, Cap is a Nazi, and Spider-Man's a black boy. Okay? And oh no, all that political correctness is what's harming Marvel. To which I think nonsense. If there's a problem stemming from who's in the costumes, it's that all these changes are happening at the same time. Essentially, none of the legacy characters are active right now. The issue is really confusion on top of confusion on top of confusion on top of overproduction on top of no kind of messaging. Look, one of the things with comics going up in value and speculation, for example, that used to happen because you had people who were interested in buying and following a series, and then new people would find out about it, and then people would want the earlier issues, and they would want like first appearances and things like that. So those first appearances become valuable. But if interest doesn't build in a single character or a single series, then there's no demand to create an increased value. The books mean nothing to anyone. So there's no one new who's going to go back and try to find things and then create any kind of speculator interest or any kind of interest in having people pay premium prices for anything. Marvel's true problem is overproduction, like I said before, and a lack of judiciousness. It's a lack of standards. That's the problem. You can't have a lack of standards with the only values being, well, let's just kind of bring in diversity and appeal to an all-new audience and use our existing legacy characters and just change them from legacy characters into something unrecognizable and expect that that's going to appeal to people. Yes, it will appeal to new people who say, oh, well, there's a new kind of Spider-Man. Wow, there's a new Spider-Man. Like, all right, yeah, fine. So they've heard of Spider-Man. There's a new Spider-Man. It's not going to appeal to any of the existing people. And either it appeals to a new audience or it doesn't. But you've lost all the momentum of all these multiple years of history. The new customer, and yeah, there's tons of those you can describe that way, can be made to want to buy into the Marvel Universe. In fact, the Marvel and DC Universe is arguably the greatest strength of serialized comics. But in order for them to successfully buy in, you have to understand the shape of what you're doing. They want to know what they're buying matters, meaning in story and continuity. They want to believe Marvel is their friend, not just the guy who's gotten used to hitting them up for money again and again. Yeah. So there's a lot of what Marvel can do to refresh itself. I'll have a link to the article so you can check out the whole thing for yourself. But really, you need an editor-in-chief at Marvel who is focused on producing a line of comics. And every company needs this if they're going to produce more than one or two comics. They need a vision of what the company stands for, what your brand stands for when you buy a Marvel comic or a DC comic, or in my case, an APMG comic. Like, what is an APMG comic all about? If you want people to be consistent buyers of the material, they have to be able to relate to the characters. They have to have ongoing series. People want to see sequels. They want to find out more about the characters that they relate to and that they're interested in. You have to do ongoing titles, with a certain commitment to telling a story, and you can't just change everything randomly all the time. You can have special stories, and a hero can become a villain, but you have to explain what the heck happened. And ultimately, that hero has to return to being a hero after taking a break as being a villain for a storyline. I'll see you again soon with another video. And again, if you want to support my work, definitely subscribe, click the bell for notifications. Back College of the Dead. It's shipping now, College of the Dead. Graduation Day. It's the second in an ongoing series. We're working on the third. The second one's shipping immediately. And you can also sign up at epicmermaids.com for the mermaids. It's like Game of Thrones with mermaids, a very cool series coming soon. I will see you again soon with another video, and if I don't see you, I will miss you.